All right, so once we've gotten everything clean, we've used the proper solvents, we've got all the passageways open, we're going to go ahead and put it back together. Of course, we always recommend that you're going to use genuine Graco parts. You know, I always recommend you get the right stuff, and you only have to rebuild it as really necessary versus using substandard O-rings and parts. We want to use plenty of Fusion lube on the O-rings. It comes in a little toothpaste tube. Making sure all the O-rings are free of nicks, that the sealing surfaces are clean where that O-ring is going to sit. We don't want to cut the O-ring when we put it back in. This is the main air piston. When the air is on this side, it'll go forward and it'll be shutting off the gun. When the air passage is on this side, it's going to go back and it's actually going to line up the mix chamber with the chemical ports, and then we'll be spraying. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we do the final kind of setup of the gun. So we just want to make sure that that piston moves freely. Notice it's got flats here, so it's keyed to keep that from spinning. So just line that up and push it in. So then we're going to examine our O-rings and our spool, make sure they're clean. Again, this is one where we want to take a little care, make sure that we get it lined up so that we don't nick those O-rings. And when we use the screwdriver or a tool, make sure that we get it all the way in, but we want to make sure we don't cut that O-ring. You can see where that trigger end has come through. So the trigger has a spring on it. This air inlet does not have a O-ring seal, but if you look closely, there's a machine taper. We want to make sure that taper doesn't have any debris or tape or anything like that. That will allow the air to leak. A dab of grease. That's started. So we're going to snug that up. We don't have to go overly tight. Again, this is not a fluid pressure seal. This is all air seal. Put the O-ring here. Make sure that it's clean. I like to get grease on all the threads. That way, if it does cross over, you'll be able to tear it apart without too much trouble. Anything that has a wrench flat, we can go ahead and put a wrench on there. If it's just knurled, we don't want this overly tight. We don't need to put pliers on there. I usually like to just take a little bit of a rag so the grease doesn't restrict me. Just get it tight, hand tight. Anything with a flat, of course, we'll go wrench tight. We want to make sure that the safety is all the way engaged and the piston's forward, so when we go to put the fluid section on, this won't be too far back and we won't have to struggle with that. So we can go ahead and replace our plug. We can put a little stainless steel pipe sealant, tape. Again, it doesn't have to be overly tight, it's just an air seal. Then make sure that screen is good and clean, and we're going to replace that exhaust muffler. Of course, this has a wrench flat, so we want to go more than hand tight. So that's the air section of this gun. We can actually, before we assemble the fluid section, we can trigger the gun and make sure everything's working. We say the air pressure can go as high as 120. Anything more than 80 psi is really more than enough. So first with the, make sure that air coming through. That's the air purge air that would be captured by this O-ring. So we know that that passageway I was talking about is free and clear. So I'm getting plenty of airflow there. Okay, so that's the air section, then we're going to move on and get the fluid section back together again. Okay, so we're going to put the fluid section back together. Again, be mindful that we have an A side and an A naught or a B side. We don't want to mix and match the parts. They're machined exactly the same, but there's always a little bit of residual chemical on there, and we don't want to react into the gun. So it's a good idea to keep the A and the B parts separate. So I want to start with putting that retaining ring back on. Again, if you look here, you can see this sharp groove here is for the retaining ring, and this more radius groove is for the O-ring. When we put this back on, we're going to make sure that we don't end up in this groove, we have to go a little farther and walk it on, and we want to kind of be careful with that because I don't want to be nicking up this edge here, or we're going to get an air leak when purge air is going to be coming where we don't want it to go. So we'll start with the retaining ring. It's important that we look at the threads not only on the retaining ring here, but here and here. If the anodized coating is gone, you'll notice these are an aggressive Acme thread, and it actually, the distance of the thread depth is what engages that side seal. So we have the side seal cartridge with that spring I already showed you. This is a mechanical seal. If I don't get the right compression, this O-ring will be exposed, and you can actually extrude it out the gun when it's under pressure. So it's really important that you make sure that you don't wire wheel this, or you don't mess up with the thread dimensioning, because that's what provides the mechanical force along with this spring to make that side seal. So if you're blowing off this O-ring a lot, make sure that this bore is clean and didn't get all chewed up. Make sure that your threads, they call them an Acme thread, notice they're square, not sharp, and that everything's clean there and burr free. So let's go ahead and put that retaining ring back on. This is where we have to kind of lock this spring, get it started. We're going to use our small screwdriver. Just going to lock that spring on. Okay, so I'm only in that first groove. Remember, it's the O-ring groove on the outside. So the key is to get that leading edge all the way into the groove. We'll lock it in place, and so that's on the back groove, not on the front groove where this O-ring goes. And making sure these O-rings are clean. If not, replace them. I'm actually going to grease that in here versus here, so I can make sure that I get the seal where that's going to go. Otherwise, I won't be able to get too much grease on there, or the proper amount. So we also have the front O-ring. This one sits in an ID groove. Again, that's the one that seals against the smooth bore of the air cap. And this one will be on the smooth bore of the handle. So before I put that on there, we're going to want to put our pieces back together. The A1 is still together, matching the A side. I want to just get that started. If I get it too far in, when I go to put the mix chamber into the gun, we don't want to be knocking the side seal off the cartridge, and we'll lose it into the drum head or the bench or onto the floor. So just get it started. So go ahead and put the O-rings back on the B side seal cartridge. 3 O-rings total. The 2 bigger ones go onto the cartridge assembly. Make sure it's not in the groove that we put for the screwdriver leverage. Here's the side seal. Again, make sure there's no scratches on the surface that's shiny here. If I can catch it with my thumbnail, we want to make sure that gets replaced. The mechanical spring seal. So we're just going to put a little grease on there. Line that up. And we always want to make sure if I push on that side seal, see how it springs back. Especially on the A cartridge with the isocyanate and the way it can react to the different solvents. We want to make sure everything's good and clean. If that spring isn't free to float, it won't seal well against the side seal and will cross the gun over right away. So this is a knot. And we want to get that started, but we don't want it so far in that we're going to knock that side seal off. You can notice this one's in a little far. You can actually see it extruding or protruding into where the mix chamber. Okay, so at this point we can put our mix chamber on. Again, we put this what I call a witness cut. They've machined a little groove there. That's to identify the A side of the mixed chamber. They are laser etched, but after time, the laser etching gets harder to see. We don't want to be mixing the A port with the B port. It would probably work, but you're going to be mixing even though I have some residual here. Make sure that what you see here, there's a little bit of kind of wear marks, but there's nothing I would be able to catch with my thumb that would prevent that seal from happening. So the A on the gun, my witness cut. Just gonna get that in there. Make sure they both kind of have that spring back. And we're just gonna put a good amount of grease on these Acme threads so that if it does get some chemical leakage in there, it'll be easily to take that apart again. So again, there's knurl here. I don't need to get a wrench on there. Keep the gun clean. We have this PTFE white O-ring here. That's kind of a wiper to keep this part clean, to keep chemical from coming in. It's not really an air seal. But we want to make sure that's good and clean. Okay, so we have the inlet screen and check valve assembly. This O-ring actually seals against the mix manifold when it's bolted onto the gun. This O-ring seals into the gun head bore. Okay, so this is a check ball assembly. It's a one-way check. The fluid chemical can go that way. It tries to prevent the chemical from going back when the ball seats. That's actually spring-loaded. And then we have the spring retainer. When we're putting this spring retainer back in, we want to make sure that we don't screw it in too far because we don't want to restrict that ball travel. So I like to just get it where it's just flush, maybe one full thread in, then it's not going to restrict that ball travel. Our inlet screen, we have 3 different meshes. 80 is kind of the standard. But depending on your process, you might want a coarser mesh screen than what the 80 provides. This is the B. We're going to make sure the bore is clean. It just sits in there until it's flat. The one marked A goes to the A. Make sure it's flat. And the last thing to put together is our clean off air needle valve. Press that into place. For a starting point, I'm just going to keep that closed because I want to listen for some air leaks, but then we'll adjust that when we go to put that together. So remember, we want to put a little grease here where that internal ring seals. Make sure that the air cap is pushed all the way back and that the piston is all the way forward. So when we go to put it together, there'll be clearance. Again, remember, this is keyed. So once we get the thread started, we just want to line up. The grease zerk and the air purge will be to the top. You can feel when it engages the handle. Again, knurled threads, so I don't need pliers on there. I don't need a wrench. I'll grab a rag, make it a good hand tight. We're just going to recover the greaser. Okay, so that's pretty much the symbol of the gun. Couple of things we want to check when we get it back together here. I want to put the hose manifold on, or my service block that comes in the gun kit, just to retain these check valves, or otherwise when I put air that will come out of there. So we'll just use the hose manifold. Again, making sure that there's no burrs for the O-rings, making sure that threaded insert is clean and chemical free. If this is our spare gun, we'd want to make sure that we put that nightcap on there and we keep everything clean. Notice the spring clip. The purpose of that is it won't allow this ring and a ratchet pawl kind of a setup to come undone while you're working the gun. So there'll be no danger of the fluid section separating from the air section. I'll get you a better look at that once I get this on there. So it's kind of a spring tight. If this were to start loosening up, you heard that click. Now it, even though it's loose, it won't come completely off the gun. So you always want to make sure that that spring clip is in place. That is the purpose. Okay, so when we put the air to our gun, we want to listen for air leaks. We'll talk about adjusting the clean off air properly. So notice that the safety's on. When the air came on, it moved the piston forward. If you're spraying and you were to lose your air supply, compressor stopped, this is the way to shut off the flow of the chemical is just to push the stop, and it did the same thing as the air would. Notice that it came forward, and we're stopping the chemical flow, so then we can go back to the truck to find out what happened to our air supply. So that's kind of just give a push on the gun, and that'll shut off the fluid flow. Shut off that clean off air. So right now I only have purge air. What I want to do is trigger the gun, and I want to make sure it's quiet. So I have the clean off air. There's no purge because it would be flowing chemical right now. That gun's pretty quiet. So then I can adjust my clean off air. And we say usually a half turn or so. You can barely hear the air. It's just coming across this tip. And it's going to kind of keep that cap from coagulating. So this gun is pretty much ready to go. When we go to spray, I just like to put some fusion lube on the surfaces here. That way if it gets coated with foam, it'll wipe off pretty clean. So, but when we store it, we want to kind of keep it in clean so it doesn't get sawdust and dirt and whatever. So this gun's ready to go. We can either put it back onto our hose manifold on the machine, or we can put it in our spare gun box.